Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chafei, Volume 25, the Sicha for Parshas Vayeishev / Yutas Kislev. This Sicha will explain how already in the phase of imprisonment, of Golus, of the story of Yutas Kislev, already there was the objectives of the Geula were already present and prevalent. And likewise, how this plays a role in our Golus that we are in now and the Geula objectives. Just note, please, that chapters 8, 9, and 10 will be omitted, as it's a very long Sikha, but we definitely will make a point to cover the main points of the Sikha. As a quick introduction, the Holy Shalah stands for Shnei Luches Habris, which is the name of his work. Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, who was a great Kabbalist, and in fact very much connected to Hasidus Chabad, to Yutas Kislev, as we know that one of the sources that the Alter Rebbe heavily relied on when he was composing the Tanya was the Sefer HaShalah. Another thing is that any time we find in the Torah varying explanations, varying even commentary on the very same word or the very same topic, although on the surface they seem to be different and sometimes even opposing, but yet they must be really connected somewhere deep down. In other words, there must be a way to reconcile them, and to not only reconcile them, but also have them complement each other, as we know that the Torah is Torah's emes, the Torah of truth. Truth is only one, and therefore there has to be a seamless connection between all the three. Sometimes it requires some work, but it definitely is there. So let's get into the Sikha. The Shalah writes, actually in this week's Parsha, in Parshas Vayeishev, and this is in regards to Hanukkah, that all the special events, all the festivals of the year are connected with the Parsha that's read around that time, around the festival. Even those festivals, those Yomim Tovim, that were established after biblical times are also already incorporated, as we know that everything's by divine providence, and the Torah already foresaw it, and therefore it definitely is connected. Sometimes one has to look for it, but it definitely has a source in the Parsha of the week. From this it's understood that therefore Vayeishev has a special connection to Yutas Kislev, as Yutas Kislev typically almost always falls out of the week in which we study, in which we're going to read Parshas Vayeishev. However, at first glance, it seems that there's no connection at all. In fact, there's the opposite of a connection between Vayeishev and Yutas Kislev. Why? Vayeishev speaks about the whole cause of how we all ended up descending, perhaps even against our will, to Egypt, how all the Yidden ended up in Mitzrayim, and this is the begin. It's all about the beginning of Galus Mitzrayim, the enslavement, the imprisonment of Mitzrayim, and in fact, it has clearly the enslavement and imprisonment of Yosef HaTzadik, whereas Yutas Kislev is about the day that, as it says, Chufsha nitna lo, that the Alter Rebbe got his full release and freedom on this day. So how do these two connect? How do we successfully follow this idea of the Shalom? So the Rebbe says we'll understand this by first explaining that which is known, that and is explained in many places in Chassidus, that the Golus of Mitzrayim, this exile, this enslavement of Mitzrayim, was not some kind of punishment. It was not some kind of retribution, because what did they do wrong? Rather, it had a purpose, it had an objective. And that is, as Hashem already had told Avrohom way before, way in advance, that afterwards they will leave with great riches, which is not only begashmius, of course, literally, they're going to leave with much riches, but it's also and especially the spiritual gains that they were meant to have by being in Mitzrayim. First and foremost, primarily, the fact that this prepared them for Matan Torah, and also, as we know, the sparks of holiness which they succeeded in raising from the time that they were in Mitzrayim. Throughout the time of Mitzrayim, they succeeded in elevating the sparks of holiness that were there. Now, this gets expressed especially by Yosef HaTzadik. Yosef HaTzadik, this idea, Yosef HaTzadik was forcibly brought down to Egypt, which obviously on the surface seems like a very negative thing. However, what was the purpose of it? What was really the objective? Was it to hurt Yosef, to make him suffer? No. As he himself later told his brothers, don't worry, don't feel bad. Because really it's Hashem who orchestrated all of this. It's Hashem who set me down here in order for me to be Lemichya Shlachani Elokim Lefnechem. In order for me to be a source of sustenance and a source of refuge for all of you in this dire time of the famine. And this actually is emphasized in the words of the Medrash Rabbah on the words on the verse Vayeishev Hurad Mitzrayim, which literally translates Yosef Hurad was forcibly taken down, descended to Mitzrayim. However, the Medrash says that within the word Hurad, you can also read Hurad to mean like a conquest, a kifshoin, a rulership. As it says in Tehillim, says the Medrash, if you look in chapter 72 in Tehillim, verse 8, Ayin Beis Pasuk Ches, it says, V'yerd miyom ad yom, that we will rule from one ocean to another ocean, from one side of the world to the other side of the world. What word is used there? V'yerd, which is the same root word as Hurad, albeit with a different meaning. So that means that the whole entire purpose, the objective of Yosef being Hurad Mitzrayim, being forcibly taken down to Mitzrayim, was in order for him to be Hurad in the sense of rulership, in the sense of conquest, to rule over Mitzrayim, as indeed it was at the end. And likewise, now we can appreciate the connection, likewise by Yutas Kislev. The imprisonment of the Alter Rebbe and later the redemption, the freedom, are not two separate things that happen to coincide, but rather the entire reason, the entire purpose of the imprisonment was what would come later after the release as a result of the redemption, namely the revelations that will come afterwards. As we see, in fact, that's what happened, that the spreading of Chassidus, Afatzas Hamayonis, the spreading of the well springs, came in a disproportionate manner after Peterburg, after the Alter Rebbe was released. Following what the Rebbe Rashab said, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he says, even though it's difficult to say this, but the fact is that this is so, and he quoted the sages who say, Hazayis Hazeh, this olive, the olive, Hashem made it in such a way that only when you squeeze it, only when you crush it, do you get the full appreciation of it, because that's when it gives off its oil. And likewise, through the challenges and all the difficulties of what the Alter Rebbe went through in Petersburg, that is through the imprisonment, that's when the true revelation of the inner teachings of the Torah, the inner teachings of the Alter Rebbe were now revealed, were now released. And we see that this is exactly what happened, that they took on a whole different phase, a whole different era was ushered in after the release from Petersburg. And this is to such a degree that not only amongst Jews was there a greater revelation of Chassidus, thus godliness, but even as the Alter Rebbe himself writes in the letter after Yutas Kislev, about Yutas Kislev, he writes that even the Goyim said, and they agreed and they pushed, then they said that now you could reveal Chassidus. Now the secrets of the Torah can be. That means even the world agreed to it. Even the world cooperated with this idea. So far we have an idea how Vayeishev and Yutas Kislev perhaps parallel. However, says the Rebbe, even after this explanation, there still remains a question. It's still not 100% smooth, as they say. Why? Because soif, bottom line, Parshas Vayeishev, what does it speak about in the clear and obvious? What is the obvious narrative in Parshas Vayeishev? Not about what will be later. That doesn't come till much later. That doesn't come till Parshas Vayigash. That doesn't come till much later. But now, in this Parsha, Parshas Vayeishev, at least what is obvious, at least what is clear in the narrative, is that Yosef has a forcible descent, has an enslavement in Mitzrayim. The positive outcome, like I said, is not mentioned till later. So how does this connect directly to Yutas Kislev? Well, Yutas Kislev is already the positive outcome that came about. Says the Rebbe, this compels us to say, to look deeper, that in this parsha, in Parshas Vayeishev itself, there's already an aspect of the Geula, already an aspect of the positive outcome, albeit it's hidden somewhere in the narrative. And says the Rebbe, this we'll see by taking another look at the Medrash. The Medrash on the words, again, on the word Hurad, that he was forcibly taken down to Mitzrayim, right? Which, of course, like we said, that's the literal meaning. Says the Medrash, like we said before, that it means kivshoin, it means a conquest. That the Medrash is not saying, now follow this, the Medrash is not saying that this will later result in a conquest. No, the Medrash is saying is that in the word Hurad itself, which means that he was taken down, that he was forcibly taken to Mitzrayim, in this word itself, there's also the word of V'yerd miyom al yom, that he will rule, that he will conquer, that he will be the one in charge of Mitzrayim. That's number one. Number two, the Medrash continues and it says that there is another pirush in the word Hurad, and that is that Yosef brought down with him, Hurad, he made come down, he made descend into Mitzrayim, godliness, the Shechina, he brought the Shechina to Mitzrayim with him. Prior to that, it wasn't there. Yosef brought it with him, and where do we see it? Clearly, the pasuk says that everything that Yosef did succeeded. Vayehi Hashem es Yosef, that Hashem was there with Yosef, and it was obvious that even the goyim saw it and appreciated it. Now we know, as we said in the introduction, whenever we have several explanations on the same word, that they all ultimately connect, even though they may seem to be different one from another, and perhaps sometimes even opposed to one another. But when you look deeper, they all connect. How do we connect these three? Again, just to summarize, Hurad, which means literally that it took him down against his will to be enslaved. And then number two, Hurad, that he ruled over them. And number three, Hurad, that he brought the Shekhinah with him. So his Rebbe explains that in the process of redemption in general, redemption from Galus, freedom from Galus that is, there's three general methods. There's three general aspects. You have one, which is in B'derech Milchama, in a warring manner. What do you mean? You combat the opposition till you overpower it. Now, such a redemption from Galus, such a, we'll call it a win, is not the ultimate. It's not the on top of the chart. Why? Because number one, in order to gain such a win, you have to actually lower yourself down to the enemy's taxes. And you have to take up arms, and you have to deal with all kinds of destructive things. And we actually see this in reality, an example for this, that David HaMelech, who fought many, many wars, and he actually managed to subdue the enemy. But how did he do it? By means of engaging in active war with them. And later, he paid a price for it. Why? Because Hashem said to him, you cannot build a Beis HaMikdash because Dam Rov Shafachta. You spilled a lot of blood. Now, of course, he didn't spill the blood just like that. He did it for a very positive cause, a very positive purpose. But the fact is that he did. And that's the point, that in order to gain this victory, in order to overpower and subdue the negative forces, you have to actually get down and dirty, so to speak. And that has an effect on you. That's number one. Number two, the Hebrew word for battle is krav. But it comes from the etymology of kiruv, of getting close. At the end of the day, you have to get close with the opposing side in order to combat it, in order to win it. So this is one manner in which you can have a geula, a redemption, a victory over the negative forces, over the gullus. Then there's a second manner, and that is called pidiya b'sholem. A redemption that comes through peace. What does that mean? That a person is in a state, the people are in a state of pidiya v'geula, a state of redemption, a state of freedom. Not I mean, that is because you are so disproportionately stronger than the opposing side that a total and absolute fear befalls upon them. And you stand basically way above and way beyond the tzad shekeneged, the opposing side, than the forces of negative. In other words, you don't get involved with them. You win them over in a manner of peace because you don't have to engage a war. You don't have to have the kiruv. You don't have to have the krav. You don't have to have the combat, which means to get close with them. Of course, this method, this aspect of winning, is much better than the previous one mentioned. But still, at the end of the day, it's not the ultimate conquest. Why? Because in such a manner of geula, in such a manner of winning, of subduing the enemy, still, the enemy has not been dealt with. The bad has not been transformed. The opposing party still remains there as it was, albeit subdued. But it's not transformed. It remains in its own state. Then there is the ultimate type of redemption and from the opposing and negative forces. And that is that you get down actually with and to fight with the opposing parties. However, you do not do it in a way where you get down and dirty and get, so to speak, dragged in to their dirtiness, but rather you redeem the galus. You take the galus, and the galus becomes geula. There's a direct contact with an opposing side. However, you come with such a great power, meaning a source of spiritual strength, that it totally transforms the negative into positive. And these three manners of geula and dealing with the galus, dealing with the negative forces, the forces of negative, we actually find paralleled in the three groups, the Shvatim in general, the tribes, and the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, versus Yosef. You see, what were the Shvatim? The Shvatim in general, we find that they all were shepherds. What was the purpose? Why were they shepherds? Why did they choose this profession? Because this allowed them to be isolated from the world. And that means what? Let's translate that. That really the world, meaning the negative forces, the negativity of the world, actually plays a role. Yes, it has a power. And it possesses a danger, therefore. And therefore, in order not to get entrapped in it, in order not to get sucked into it, the only method you can do is to distance yourself from it. Right? Because you know that the moment you get involved in it, then you are going to get dirty with it. So therefore, they chose to be distant from it. They chose to kind of remove themselves from most of society, not to get entrenched in the negativity. Then you have the Avos. The Avos were directly involved in the world. We don't find them to be necessarily shepherds and be distant and isolated from the world. However, at the same time, the reason why the world and the negativity world did not affect them is because they were way above it. They were connected to such a high source that the world, while they were in it, even didn't play a role and didn't affect them in any way. Then comes Yosef. Yosef HaTzadik was so involved in worldly matters, and the fact is, the case in point, is that he was the ruler of Mitzrayim. You cannot be a ruler of a country without being directly involved in all the aspects of the country. So he was there, he was involved, he was entrenched, yet not only was he not affected by it, but on the contrary, he influenced Mitzrayim. Not just later when he became the ruler of Mitzrayim, but already from the very beginning. While he was still enslaved and imprisoned, he already was influencing Mitzrayim. He was already conquering Mitzrayim. Where do you see that? What does that mean? The fact is that his connection to godliness was so great, was so intact, and so active, that even while he was totally submerged in serving his master Potiphar, and later in the prison, and later as a ruler of Mitzrayim, but they all recognized and saw, wow, this is a godly man. In other words, through him, Mitzrayim saw godliness to the extent that Potiphar exclaimed and he said, wow, everything he does It's Hashem who's bringing him success. So he was already conquering Mitzrayim. He was already subduing Mitzrayim while still enslaved and while still totally engrossed and involved in Mitzrayim. Now we can appreciate the connection and how it all not only connects but complements each other. The three pirushim, these three translations on the word hurad in the Medrash. From the second that Yosef was, quote, hurad Mitzrayim, from the second that Yosef was forcibly brought down to Mitzrayim, already he was hurad, he was already conquering, he was already ruling over Mitzrayim. How so? By being moited godliness into Mitzrayim, by bringing down godliness into Mitzrayim. Along these lines was exactly what happened to Alter Rebbe. And now we can appreciate the true connection between Vayeishev and Yutas Kislev. It's true that everything that happened to the Alter Rebbe during the imprisonment was all absolutely with his consent. And this is proven by the fact, for example, if we all remember the story, what happened on Erev Shabbos, when Alter Rebbe asked them not to travel, not to continue traveling, because he would not travel after midday Friday, and they refused, of course, to take orders from a prisoner. And what happened? Notwithstanding the fact that they had 4 strong stallions that pulled that carriage, it couldn't budge from its place. So you understand that whatever happened with the total and absolute consent of the Alter Rebbe. But still, the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned. He agreed to it. In other words, this was a process that the Alter Rebbe agreed to and was totally involved in. On the one hand, he was a prisoner by them, right? And it involved hardship and suffering. On the other hand, however, this is precisely the way in which the Alter Rebbe succeeded in influencing them from within. In other words, he made a total transformation by having direct contact with them. And this came, for example, by means that because he was a prisoner, and they gave him all these questions, and they interrogated him on all kinds of matters and that pertain to the teaching of Chassidus and belief in God, and so on and so forth. And the Alter Rebbe took the time and effort to explain it to them, even on their level, that even these goyim with their goyish minds were able to understand it. And this is what Alter Rebbe expresses later in the letter that he writes about the redemption of Yutas Kislev, the miracle of Yutas Kislev, and he writes that Hifli v'hiktil ases, that Hashem did wondrous things. That what? That even the goyim, Anu v'Amru al Zois, even the goyim expressed and exclaimed about this, that this is certainly from Hashem. That the goyim saw and understood that everything is from Hashem. And this is exactly what happened to Yosef. As Yosef was brought down in Mitzrayim, Yosef was forcibly brought down to Mitzrayim. In this case, the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned, and that was all not with the ultimate purpose of later coming to a greater and positive objective. But already then they started to, as Yosef did, started to bring godliness into there, started to transform Mitzrayim. And in this case, the Alter Rebbe was already in the process of transforming the Tsarist regime, the Tsarist government, that they should appreciate godliness, that they should understand that Chassidus is vital and necessary. So the Rebbe, every single thing in the Torah, in the world in general, but Torah in particular, is a directive, is a lesson for us in how to serve Hashem. Especially when it's such an important, fundamental story, and one that happened with a major leader in Yiddishkeit. The fact that a Yid is in Golus is not because we're here to be punished or to suffer, but rather it's for us to bring light and to illuminate the darkness of Golus. How? By Ner Mitzvah v'Torah. By the mitzvah is like a candle and Torah is the light. And to accomplish this, how do we accomplish this? Because we have access to a higher source, a heightened source of light. And nowadays, of course, we know it as Pnimius HaTorah, the teachings of Chassidus. Because if you think about it, if you look at the Choshech HaGolus, if you look at the darkness of the Golus, then we are a very, very small minority. Even amongst Yidden, those who follow Torah mitzvahs actively, at least as it is so far till now, hopefully that will change soon, those who follow Torah and mitzvahs is also a minority. So we're a minority within minority. So one could think to himself, how do I have the power? How do I have the strength to overcome all the challenges, the darkness of Golus? Maybe it's better for me to wait till that all dissipates and goes away, and then I can do my avodah, then I can bring light. And here's where the lesson comes in. That the world is not mitzias b'fnei atzmi. The world is not an autonomous entity separate from Hashem. And that everything that happens is with Hashem, from Hashem and with Hashem. And already in the descent to Golus, as we explained, in the descent to the enslavement, you already have the conquest of Golus. And that is the purpose of it. Why? Because we have a much greater resources, much greater power than the darkness itself. We're able to overpower it even while it seems that we're enslaved to it, even while it seems that we're entrenched in the dark world. And of course, through all of these activities and efforts of bringing light to the Golus, of making the world a better place, certainly we will zeicher that not only that it remains something in theory, we will see it lepoil mamish in actuality, because of mamish with the coming of Mashiach.